All right, Crim 20, let us knock out Chapter 5, Prison Systems. This chapter is a little bit shorter than the last one, for sure. And we are going to kind of move on to the prison system now. As you probably already know, prisons are places for convicted felons only. So these are sentenced, convicted felons only. And in California, after AB 109, Prop 47, all that kind of stuff, we actually only have serious violent felons in prison at this time in California. So, prison systems, only for serious violent felons in California. And they are sentenced. Okay. So these are institutions designed to house convicted adult felons serving more than a year. You probably already knew that. So Plata versus Brown. This is a case that actually it started in 2001, I believe. That's how long it took for this case to work its way through the court system and then ultimately make its way to the Supreme Court let me back up. Rhodes versus Chapman is the first case that we're talking about from 1981. This was a case where the Supreme Court said that it was not cruel and unusual punishment per the Eighth Amendment for 2 inmates to be housed in a cell that was designed for 1. Okay, so that was 1981. Then comes Plata versus Brown, which is, again, I believe the issues in Plata versus Brown were initially arose in 2001. Plata got sick, and he was in prison in California, and he put a request in to see the nurse because he was sick, and he waited and waited and waited, and we're talking days and days and days, and he kept getting more sick. And he was getting frustrated because he was not receiving medical care. And finally, he's questioning people like, hey, is there a reason why nobody has seen me? And ultimately, the nursing staff said, I'm sorry, dude, we're just too busy. There's not enough of us. We can't provide you with the proper medical care because there aren't enough of us here, and you guys, there's too many of you. So that case worked its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 2011. At that time, the United States Supreme Court said, California, this is the example of cruel and unusual punishment. You are way overpopulated in your prisons, and basically, you need to release the additional 40% over 100%. So ultimately, California was operating at 140% of capacity at that point. You need to release that extra 40% within a certain period of time, or we, the federal government, are going to come in and take over your state prison system. That's how AB 109, realignment, is probably a word you've heard before. The prison realignment law came into effect. A lot of people think that we voted for it. We did not vote for it. Governor Brown really had very few options. I'm not a huge fan of AB 109, but I really don't think that a lot of people will blame Governor Brown and say it was his fault. And honestly, I don't know that he had much of a choice. It was release inmates or lose control of your prison system. And then the feds were going to release the inmates anyway. So it was rough. This was a really rough time to work in the world of corrections at all. Even as a probation officer, this was a rough time. So most law enforcement, corrections, any agency, honestly, is going to have a mission statement. When you're going in for job interviews, make sure you know the mission statement of your agency. It's always on their website. It's general, kind of basically talks about what their goals are. New penology, no, that is not a dirty word. So the whole purpose and goals of the prison system has kind of changed back and forth throughout time. At one point, it was all about punishment, and then it was all about rehabilitation, and then it was all about punishment again, and now we have gone all the way back to the rehabilitation mode. So The concept of what the goal is changes throughout time, and we are definitely back to the concept of rehabilitation. How did our prison system become so horrifically overcrowded? It was a perfect storm. A lot of things happened. We saw drugs really come in and take over in the United States. A lot of us would say that we have a significant problem with drugs now. Having lived in the 1990s, I honestly would have to say I still think it was worse back then than it is now. I mean, I'm not saying that drugs are not an issue now, but I lived during the crack era. And if you were alive during that time, seeing the ridiculous amount of violence, death, desperation that took place during that time, it was pretty insane. And, you know, I was probably a student at City College during that time. And I don't know that I could even explain to you how crazy the world, yeah. Look, I'm trying to tell you how crazy the world is when we're in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. But anyways, it was a crazy time. The war on drugs, it actually, I think, started just before Ronald Reagan was there, but it kind of really gained steam when Ronald Reagan was president. And the war on drugs was ultimately, people were getting put in prison for selling drugs, possessing drugs. Something that we don't really see a lot of now, but back then we did. State prison versus federal prison. There's kind of some fairly significant differences between the two. State prisons, you know, your average crime that happens on the streets right now, out on the streets of Fresno or wherever, those are going to be people who are likely going to end up in regular old state prison. Federal prisons, people who are doing things like money laundering. Martha Stewart, for example, she went to federal prison. Martha Stewart was arrested for, I believe, insider trading. Had something to do with some stock trading. I think she had some shady information about some stocks, and I think she sold some stocks before they lost their value because she'd been given some sneaky information. There's a football player, I want to say he's a local guy, Kendricks. Some of you are going to know who he is. He was a kid who went to Hoover High School, and he ended up, I think he plays for the NFL now. He was also up on some federal white-collar crimes. If he goes to prison, I think he's still pending sentencing on that. He'll probably end up in a federal prison, but typically federal prisons, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, you're talking about more white-collar criminals. The Federal Bureau of Prisons runs the federal prison system. Typically, the State Department of Corrections runs the state prisons. In California, it's the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. We do have, ICE does have another correctional system, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I know we have an ICE facility in Fresno. I don't know where it is. Well, I kind of know where it is, but I think it's a little bit of, they sort of hide it. Sentencing Reform Act of 1984. So in 1984, Congress abolished federal parole. You just heard that. There is no such thing as federal parole. They reduced the amount of good time available in federal prisons. So a lot of people will say, like, you don't want to go to federal prison. You don't want to go to federal prison because you're going to do a lot more time in federal prison. You're typically going to end up doing something like 80 to 85% of your time if you end up in federal prison. Because of this Sentencing Reform Act, and they call them truth in sentencing laws. So there's no such thing as federal parole. So if you wanted to be a federal parole officer, cross that off your list. Not a thing. There are different security levels in prisons. I'm quite certain that you know this. Supermax, things like San Quentin, Pelican Bay, these are supermax high-risk facilities. Administrative, I think they even have administrative in Corcoran, like the SHU unit, special housing, high, medium, low, minimum. Your minimum and low securities, you're probably going to have inmates who are able to go out and fight fires with CAL FIRE. So there's there's obviously you've got different risk levels. Again, in California, most if not all of our offenders are serious violent felons or violent felons. So our security levels have very likely been stepped up because of the type of offenders we have. But anyways, there are, of course, different security levels. Look at the breakdown here of the number of prisoners in U.S. prisons. Actually pretty close over those 10 years. I'd be willing to bet those numbers now are different. That last one was taken December of 2013. December of 2020, it'll be interesting to see what that number is. I don't know that number. Well, obviously, because that hasn't happened yet. Private prisons. So when I was sitting in your seats, not at your house, because in 25, 30 years ago, we were not in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, and I was sitting in a classroom. But anyways, when I was at City College taking criminology classes a long time ago, they were telling us, our professors were telling us to prepare for the private industry to take over prisons, jails, law, police agencies, all that kind of stuff. And you know what? It never actually happened. I mean, there are some private prisons, but there's so much controversy with them and so many, it just seems there's so many conflicts of interest. Imagine, you own a private prison. Typically, you're going to get offenders from the government, because those are the people are being sentenced in court, and they'll be sentenced to state prison, and the state prison is going to pay you to house their inmates because they don't have the bed space, right? That makes sense, right? So let's say you get $10,000 a month for every inmate. I'm just throwing that number out there. I don't know what that number is. I'm just throwing it out there. Well, if you don't have an inmate in that bed, then you don't get paid, right? So as a private prison, would it not benefit you to have all your beds full? Yeah, it would. So would you be encouraged to rehabilitate those offenders and get them out as quick as possible? No, it wouldn't. It would benefit you to keep them in there as long as you could, so you could keep getting money. Conflict of interest, right? That's just the beginning of the controversy that surrounds private prisons and law enforcement agencies. So we do have some private prisons, so that, don't get me wrong, that they're not non-existent, but yeah, they aren't, it's not a booming business right now. Maybe it will be someday. They probably do manage their money better than the government. I think that's the last slide. Yay.